I'm very happy to be here. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and one that we at CSU, as well as before I went to CSU, I spent about almost 10 years at Cornell, both with cooperative extension and then at the university. And so this is a topic we've been investigating now for many years, and I think we're actually starting to have some information about what we know about the economic impacts of local food. So I'm really excited to share it today. As you heard from the speakers this morning, when we talk about local food, what we're really talking about are direct-to-consumer and intermediated markets. And I think that this is something that the people in this room are aware of. But just to say that often we think about local food as synonymous with direct markets. Direct markets only represent about 35% of local food sales. And indeed, the places where we're seeing the biggest areas of growth are in these intermediated markets, sales to retailers and sales to institution and intermediary businesses. And part of the growth in interest and part of the growth in these markets has been supported through investments by USDA. There's of course been investments by states and local governments as well as philanthropic organizations, but we can see that the Farm Bill has really grown in its support of local foods, including over $500 million in 2015, over $1 billion of investment between 2008 and 2014, and over 40,000 of these infrastructure projects. And what we hear about, the rationale for supporting local and regional food system projects, and I think this is particularly true under the Obama administration. We've had less material come out about this, I think, in the new administration, is that farmers win and communities win, and particularly rural communities win, right? So this is from the American Farmland Trust. We hear this all the time. But what do we actually know about the extent to which this is true? And so what I'm going to use my time for today is to talk about what do we know about the extent to which farmers and ranchers win through these kinds of investments in markets, and what do we know about the regional economic impacts of these kind of investments. So one of the purported benefits of local and regional food is the opportunity to support small and mid-scale farms. And the reason that this is important is that if you look at this is a chart from the USDA Economic Research Service, you can see that these smaller scale producers tend to be in this red area, right? That there's a higher percentage of them that are in this red area, that they're high risk in terms of their operating profit margin, right? So they're less likely to be profitable. So do these markets actually create opportunities, especially for small and mid-scale farms? The other interesting thing about local markets is that we have very well documented evidence over the last 10 plus years that consumers are willing to pay a premium for these differentiated products, right? For local food products. This is also true of organic, right? And we could think of other differentiation as well. So well documented evidence. And we have beginning evidence that these prices at local food markets, so for example at farmers markets, have no relationship with commodity prices. So this really shows that the potential for these markets to actually act as a risk management strategy as we have fluctuating commodity prices. But in addition to actually understanding about whether there's a premium, right, so we need to understand what the expenses are. And I just thought I'd give credence. I've got two microphones on here. Can I turn this one off? Is that okay? Well, okay. USDA Ag Marketing Service several years ago decided to support new farmers market price reporting tools in I think 22 states. And if someone is here from AMS, they can correct me if I'm misstating this. But there's a lot of new data in this space now to help us really evaluate what we know about the economic impacts of these systems, right? So this dollar on the left here is probably familiar to many of you. We hear about the fact that farmers receive a decreasing share of the retail dollar who are selling through commodity markets. It's not entirely true, but that's the rhetoric that's out there. And so the question is, right, if we know that there's a willingness to pay a premium for these local food markets, right, for items purchased at these local food markets, what does that actually mean about what ends up going into the farmer's bottom line, right? About the net impacts, which ultimately is what we care about. And when we think about this sort of theoretically, we hypothesize that there's a relationship between the amount of money that the farmers get and these trade-offs between managerial control and pricing power. So in a direct market, the farmer's going to get more of that retail dollar, right? They have probably more managerial control and more pricing power, but they probably have substantial additional expenses that go into selling in those markets, right? And that there's also volume trade-offs associated with those markets. If you go to the intermediated markets, right, you're probably going to get a larger volume, but you're going to trade off some of the pricing power and managerial controls. And so we wanted to know, is there an optimal place along this continuum? And you're not supposed to read this, but I wanted to highlight the report that came out in 2015 on trends in local and regional food systems. And what this report found, that was led by Sarah Lowe out of ERS, is that though farmers and ranchers across all scales, and this is including beginning farmers, were more likely to have survived between the 2007 and 2012 census, they grew less, right? So we sort of have unclear evidence. So one of the things that we started to do at Colorado was these market channel assessments, and hopefully many of you know Matt LaRue. He would be super embarrassed right now if he saw this. So Matt is at Extension at Cornell, and he worked with Todd Schmidt, who was my mentor at Cornell when I was getting there. And so he created this market channel assessment tool. And the idea is that most of our farmers and ranchers are doing a good job tracking sales by market channel, but they're doing a less good job tracking expenses by market channel. And so what he actually does through this is track all of the associated labor and transportation costs over 1 week period during the prime production season. Now, producers love this because they have nothing going on during the prime production season, so all they want to do is collect more information. But actually, we found that this is really the only time where you can get especially accurate labor information, particularly for small and mid-scale producers who tend to have a lot of unpaid labor, right? Interns, apprentices, and we're really trying to track this by market channel. So I'm not going to spend much time telling you the results of the work that we did at Colorado with this, but I can tell you that we find, number one, there is tremendous variability in performance between direct-to-consumer channels, so within direct-to-consumer channels. You can look here at the CSAs. There's very little variability of performance across CSAs, but tremendous variability among farmers markets, and a lot of variability between CSAs and farmers markets. So we use this information now when we teach our Building Farmers program around the state, that we really want our producers to spend a lot more time in deciding which market channel they're going to start selling to, right? All farmers markets are not created equal, all wholesale markets are not created equal, and it's worth spending that time. The other thing we see from these market channel assessments is that on average, our intermediated markets perform much better than do our direct markets. So now I'm going to transition to talk about some of the national work we've been doing. I have some copies of these 2-pagers if anyone would like them. We've tried to make them less or more digestible than some of the academic articles. But we've been using the USDA's Agricultural Resource Management Survey data to actually slice and dice what we know about financial performance across these local food channels. So a couple caveats. One is that this data is meant to focus on the core ag states. It's congressionally mandated to focus on those core ag states, which often don't correspond to where we have most of the local food sales. The ARMS data surveys about 30,000 farms annually. Of that, about 1,000 of these farms sell direct-to-consumer and intermediated markets. So it's a smallish sample size, but given that, I'm going to show you what we can really see about this. So pay no attention to some of this fine print except those green bars. One of the really interesting things we see is that for farms and ranches selling through local markets, as their sales, as they get larger, right? So we can see here, this is under 75,000 on the far left, 75,000 to 350, 350 to 1 million, and over 1 million. As these farms get larger, they spend a larger percentage of their total expenses on labor. This is the exact opposite of what we think about in conventional agriculture. This really tells a different story about what efficiency means for farmers and ranchers in these markets. And our hypothesis is that it just takes real labor and marketing. You have to understand marketing to perform well in these markets, right? That there's something about the relationships that are there. You're taking on additional supply chain functions that require people to do that kind of work. You can't just substitute out capital for labor in the traditional story. So the next thing we do with this information is to divide our whole sample into quartiles. So basically, we're dividing it into 4 equal groups, and we have the top performers and the bottom performers. And then we can actually compare, well, what do the top performers look like? Because looking at averages isn't helpful. And I'm really sorry you're stuck with an economist here, but that's too bad for all of you. So we can look at things like return on assets, which is a measure of profitability. Right? So we're looking at how well people are utilizing their assets essentially here. And what you can see, this is divided by scale, is number 1, across all scales, we have about half of our farms and ranches that are breaking even. This is impressive in agriculture, folks. Remember that chart that I showed you at the beginning, looking at that operating profit margin, right? You saw those big red bars, especially for the smaller producers. This isn't bad. And the other thing that's really interesting is that if you look at those yellow bars, those are our top quartiles, you can see actually really impressive numbers in terms of return on assets. This means that we have high flyers across all scales and that there are opportunities here even for those that are making under $75,000 or less a year. Right? So I think that this is a really promising story. Now, we certainly have some folks that are losing a lot of money as well, but right, that's sort of the case. The other interesting thing we see, and some of these handouts have much more detailed information. I should have also said you can download any of this information on localfoodeconomics.com, which is the community of practice. We've really started hosting, Dawn Thilmany and myself, to make sure that this information is available and that we're interacting with more people who are working in the economics of local food. So in general, that if you look at the low performers again, as well as those top performers, we have higher flyers in the intermediated only category, right? So the bottom performers are losing more money and they're not making quite as much money across those quartiles if they're only selling through those direct markets as opposed to intermediated. So similar to that data story that I was telling you in Colorado, we're seeing similar things with the national data, right? That those intermediated markets seem to present more opportunities relative to the direct markets. So that's the snapshot of what we know about farm profitability outcomes from these kinds of channels. What do we know about regional economic development outcomes? So first is that, as you all probably know, local foods are really about urban markets. That's where most of these markets are. It's not to say we don't have rural markets, we do, but most of the markets and most of the sales are occurring in urban places. And what this means, because we still don't have a huge, farming population in urban areas, even though we talk a lot about urban agriculture, and increasingly so. This is the Census of Agriculture from Denver. I work in Colorado and do a lot of work with the city and county of Denver. According to the 2012 census, we have 10 farms farming about 143 acres. So Denver's not feeding itself on local products, especially given that the mayor wants to see 25% of all institutional purchases be from local food. So when we talk about local food as an economic development strategy, we're talking about strengthening rural-urban linkages. That's inherently what we're talking about. And so one thing we can see using that same national data is that there is no significant differences in wage rates for local food producers in rural versus urban areas. This is a really great story because in every other sector, essentially, we see that urban areas have significantly higher wage rates than do rural places, right? This is one of the reasons we have out-migration from rural places so people can get higher paying jobs, right? This is a story everybody knows. So this is a really good thing, potentially, right? This is a good snapshot about what we're seeing. The other thing is that if you look at the wage rates, you're looking at the $20 range on average across these local food systems. That is impressive, especially relative to wages in a more conventional agricultural system. We have a number of studies that look at the economic impacts of local and regional food systems. If you go to that website, localfoodeconomics.com, you can see many of those. The USDA Ag Marketing Service commissioned a toolkit a few years back that I was part of the team led by Dawn Thilmany. And so there's lots of information on thinking about what the multiplier is and how you calculate the multiplier impact associated with local food. And in general, what we see is that there are positive but very small short-term economic impacts that accrue to these communities. But a couple words of wisdom in thinking about, and words of caution in thinking about how you do these economic impacts, and in thinking about how you're talking about your project. One is that there are finite resources, and this is both on the supply side and the demand side. And so if you're thinking just about the gross impacts, you're not telling the true story. And so part of it is, if you think about farmers markets, for example. This is some work that Luann Lohr and Adam Diamond did several years ago now, but they were looking at competition for vendors at farmers markets. So if you set up another farmers market in one of these red areas, what that likely means is farmers are pulling out of one market and going to another market because you have competition here. And so what you want to think about is not what the sales are and then the multiplier of those new markets, but you actually have to think about the loss of potential sales in one market, right, and subtract that from the growth in new market, and that's really important. This is some work that David Swenson did out of Iowa State. You know, and he looked at the fact, if we're going to grow more fruits and vegetables, most of our arable land is already in production. And so if we're taking land out of, in his case, soy or corn or wheat, and we're putting it in fruit and vegetables, we have to think about the loss of those sales in corn and soy and wheat, because that also has an economic impact in our communities. So just as an example, this is some work that Todd Schmidt and David Kay and I did looking at the economic impact of a food hub a number of years ago now. And you can see that about 50% of customers reported that when the food hub came online, they purchased less from other local businesses as a result. And so we want to think about the multiplier not just associated with that new food hub, but also the loss of sales potentially to those other local businesses, right? Walmart creates jobs, Walmart sells product, Walmart has a local economic impact. If we put in a new store and it causes the sales of Walmart to decrease, we need to think about that and include it in our calculation. And what I wanted to end with is the fact that, you know, so we see that there's in general these short-term economic gains, small, that result from local and regional food system initiatives. But I would argue that that's actually not what we want to focus on measuring. That the much more important impacts are from other things that may be a little bit more difficult to measure, and that there is research to really support, right? We see that businesses near farmers markets actually have more sales on market days. Farmers markets increase property values. We see that there's some evidence to support that farmers markets may serve as incubators and help to spur new businesses. That there's knowledge exchange that actually takes place and creates new innovation, right, and new ideas, some of which can actually be developed by other small businesses or in rural communities, right, that need that kind of support. And that sales income may be less important than the skills and business experience, right? So thinking really about what are those long-term impacts that result, and how do we actually measure those? And those go way beyond thinking about the multiplier impacts in these short-term economic impact assessments. And just as one example, I've been working on a project for a number of years with the green markets in New York City. So the green markets, for those who don't know, are the largest network of farmers markets in the country. They're in all 5 boroughs in New York City. There's over 200 vendors. And I've been working on this with Todd Schmidt. And we actually asked producers about the exchange of information that happens at the market. And we also asked consumers about the exchange of information. And what we found is that 75% of the farms made changes to their farm business based on ideas that they got at the market. And that it's not just that they're making changes, they're actually taking those ideas, they're bringing them back to their home communities, they're talking to their neighbors about them, and those neighbors may also be making changes to their businesses based on those new ideas, right? Exactly what we heard this morning. And so thinking about, you know, how the human capital impacts and some of these broader impacts to communities is really important, and they can be quantified. And I think to tell the story well about what the regional economic impacts are of local and regional food systems, we need to do a lot more work in this space in actually quantifying what those impacts are. Because that's the story, I think, that's going to resonate a lot more with our municipalities, right, with our state governments, and so I look forward to being part of telling that story. Localfoodeconomics.com, as I mentioned, is our e-community of practice. Encourage you to participate. We're always looking to feature new products and projects on this website so that it continue to grow and we can kind of share these best practices. So thank you.